at that point in time, your banks were also essentially domestic institutions, with the exception of maybe one of them. But today, two of the banks are increasingly growing the asset book in Asia.
I don't think it's right to say they were just domestic. I think they had. I don't know that the change has been gathering pace over the last few years, but the internationalisation of our banks had started through acquisitions and otherwise beforehand. But the point I make is that they didn't suffer the capital problems that many other banks suffered, and they were well regulated and well capitalised, and that proved to be one of the things that helped us through the global downturn.
Your opinion on the developed economies and how they're going to be dealing with government debt, the need to have a stimulus economy, stimulus in the economy and so on. What is your reading of what the US and the UK essentially will have to do to the economies to get it back on track, you think?
Well, I think the steps that the British government, the new British government, has taken have been very good. I think they've shown a great deal of determination to get their debt under control. There's a very, very big debt problem in both the United States and the United Kingdom. Their budget deficits, 12–13% GDP, very high. I think what the British are doing is the right thing. They're trying to bring it under control.
But with the uncertainties, in front of us, there is still the...
You meet that uncertainty most effectively if you lay out a path of action which seeks to get debt under control. And I think one of the problems we face is that if the private sector lacks confidence in the determination of the government to get on top of debt and have a plan to reduce it, then that's going to affect private sector activity and private sector confidence.
If that process of liberalisation in Australia continues and government is able to raise capital as it likes and so on, which essentially has been the story of the US, what you find is that state governments or subsidiary institutions then go to market, raise debt, and then get into trouble and unable to pay their dues. So on the federal level, you might have a very strong response, but you inherit a lot of structural problems inside the system. I mean, and I think that a similar situation can arise in Australia as well.
Well, it can arise. To date, it's not representing a serious problem, but there's a lot of domestic pressure on state governments to get their debt under control. I think it's fair to point out that in one area, namely regulation of the labour market, the liberalisation process has gone into reverse in Australia. The government that took over from mine in late 2007 has rolled back a lot of the labour market reforms, and it's early days yet, but that change will have a negative impact on business, and the pain of that rolling back will be felt by business in a few years' time.
Are you a proponent of state governments going to the market directly to borrow?
Well, I'm a proponent of having a system where all governments are subjected to competitive pressures, and I think part of the challenge for state governments as well as federal governments is to maintain their high credit ratings.
How Asian is Australia? I know that this is not a question I should be asking you, but...
You can ask me any question. Well, Australia is Australian. I've been asked this sort of question on many occasions.
How Asian should Australia be?
Well, I think Australia should have tentacles into every part of the world. I mean, Australia is a nation of Western European... We're part of Western civilisation, and we speak the English language. Many of our institutions are British, but we have adapted them to suit the egalitarian circumstances of Australia, and we have very close links with North America, but we see Asia as front and centre of our foreign policy and our trade. So I think these labels are misleading.
Well, identity-wise, I know where exactly you're coming from, but in terms of policy, there seem to be pushback, there seem to be reversals of policies in terms of immigration, in terms of attitude towards Asian business and Asian immigration into Australia?
Well, let me say, as far as Asian immigration is concerned, speaking from my own time in office, I presided over a very high level of immigration, and Asian immigration increased during the time that I was Prime Minister. And it's not right to say that there's been any pushback in relation to Asian immigration. That's just a misstatement of fact. Like any other country, we will from time to time determine the level of immigration. Of course, I took a very strong stand in relation to illegal immigration, but as a result of that, public support for regular immigration rose very sharply, because people are willing to support a government that controls immigration, and they're willing to support it having a higher immigration intake.
We talked about banks. I also wanted you to say something about corporate debt. And where do you think corporate debt in Australia is heading, and what should the government do in order to manage that aspect of debt? And the reason
I don't think the government should try and micromanage corporate debt. I think the government should allow the Reserve Bank to run a transparent monetary policy. We have an independent Reserve Bank. Governments don't always agree with interest rate decisions taken by central banks. The important thing, though, is to have them independent. But I don't think government should be dictating the level of corporate debt.
Well, the reason I asked the question is that there has been instances of countries like Finland, like Ireland, where the government keeps its nose clean, but it's the corporates that go out and bring all sorts of issues.
Well, provided there are consequences for bad behaviour, that's always going to happen. Some companies will behave badly and borrow too much and get into difficulties, and provided governments don't intervene too much, then that will always go on, and that will have its own discipline in the future.
Final question. The OECD says that Australia's budget is going to be in surplus in 2 or 3 years. It looks like the economy is going to hold out well. How much of that do you take credit for?
Well, we take credit for a lot of that, because the greatest thing that our government did was to leave the new government debt-free, so that when we entered the global financial crisis, we were in better shape than virtually any other country in the world. If you go into a dark tunnel with plenty of protection, you're more likely to emerge unscathed at the other end. And that essentially is what happened to Australia. We went into that tunnel in very good shape. China was a factor, a big factor, but I think the reality that we went into the crisis in such good shape was the major reason why we came out of it so well.
John Howard, thank you very much for spending time with us.
Thank you.